Welcome back once again, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Creator Entrepreneur Podcast. We're all about ideas, influence, impact, and true income. And today we have a gentleman who took a significant risk in life, and it turned out very well. In fact, he is the living example of a creator entrepreneur who became a man of the encore years. And you'll love his story. You'll hear it right here. The program begins right now. Well, again, as promised. And we keep our promises, and we pride ourselves on that. Sometimes they're just a little bit late, but we usually try and make that happen. And we don't just have interesting stories. We have more than that. We have interesting people who usually tell interesting stories. As I say, you'll learn more here by accident than most places by design, and you might even become a little more interesting. We have fun with that. You know, he's back. Rod Miller, and he has an amazing story, and he went from a roper to a rider to a writer. I hope you caught the difference there. And now he's got all kinds of stories to tell because that's what he does. He went from writing copy to writing stories, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that. Good day. Top of the morning to you, Rod.
Well, it's good to be here, Stan. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, that's it. You've heard the pitch and the intro, so I'm just going to kind of turn it over to you, and I'm going to just kind of sit here with my cup of coffee, and I'm going to listen to that story because I would love to know more about a person who changes their life and perhaps even in their encore years creates something new. So you've certainly done that, so you have a story to tell. And as we say, hey, 3 seconds, you're on.
Well, here we go then. My name's Rod Miller. You probably caught that from the introduction. And I grew up in a small town in Utah, a really small town. When I grew up there were maybe 500 people and a whole lot more cows than that, but it was a small town. It was so small that people there didn't really even have a lifestyle. We just had lives. We just lived from day to day and did what we did. Most of the people there raised cattle, horses, and most of them also raised a little hay and maybe some grain. And most of the men also worked jobs outside of that. And a lot of them worked in mines. There were mines up in the mountains near where I grew up, and a lot of people worked up there. A lot of them were hard rock miners. And so it was kind of just a blue-collar agricultural kind of town, and we just kind of went about our living from day to day. When I was in junior high school, I guess was the first time I had any inkling that I could string words together. I learned that when we had tests that if it was an essay question, I could do pretty well. I could make something up and make it sound convincing, but I didn't do so well if I had to deal with numbers or anything like that. But I wrote for what passed as a junior high school paper, which was a mimeographed couple of sheets stapled together, and a lot of you will probably not even remember what mimeographs are, but they were these little purple and blue typed sheets that we passed out for our school newspaper. I got to high school. I worked on the school newspaper there and was also the reporter for the Future Farmers of America chapter. So I did a lot of writing for that. And again, I did well in the classes where I could write, and not so well as in the classes, the sciences and that sort of thing. But I was good at putting words together even then. But growing up where I did, there was no concept of anybody being a writer. in Goshen, Utah, you couldn't be a writer as far as I knew. There just wasn't any example. There was nobody who did that. And so it was just not even on my mind other than maybe pursuing journalism. So I went off to Utah State University and enrolled in agriculture and journalism classes, deciding I'd be an ag journalist and write for some farm magazines and some ranch magazines and that sort of thing. But while I was there, you had to, in journalism, you had to choose a sequence to specialize in, and for some reason, I chose broadcasting, and I have no idea why other than radio and television. They were these intriguing things that happened far away. Used to stay up late at night at home listening to AM radio stations from Oklahoma and New Mexico and California and Chicago. But this was mystery, and I didn't understand how it worked at all, so I thought maybe I'd learn something about it. And I did, and I ended up working in the control room in the campus radio station back when National Public Radio was brand new. And I also got a job later working in a commercial AM radio station downtown in the city where I went to school, and did that for a few years and enjoyed that. I graduated from college finally and ended up I worked for the university for a year in their radio and television broadcasting service. Ended up getting a job in a small television station in Twin Falls, Idaho. And I was working there in master control, running the air shifts and directing newscasts and directing interview shows and recording commercials and all that sort of thing. And there was a fellow who worked downstairs in the office who left. He'd been down there writing commercials for the local advertisers. And the production manager pulled me aside and said, "You have a degree in journalism, right?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "So you can write, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, how would you like to spend half of your time down in the office writing commercials and the other half up in the control room doing what you've been doing?" And I said, "Gee, why not?" And so I started writing commercials. Didn't know first thing about what I was doing, really. But I noticed that the best commercials came from these places called advertising agencies. And it turned out I liked writing these commercials and wanted to be good at it. So I started learning about advertising agencies and what they did and where they were and how they worked. Ended up getting a job at a small advertising agency in another part of Idaho, over in eastern Idaho. And I stayed in that town for, about 5 years, I guess. I worked at the agency for a couple of years, and then the art director I was working with there, convinced me that we should open our own place. And so we did. We went in business with another partner. The three of us opened an ad agency and did that for a couple of years, but we just weren't able to sustain it. And I ended up selling out to another ad agency and worked for them for a while, and then left and went to Reno, Nevada to work. And the art director I'd worked with in Idaho Falls and was a partner with came to Reno. There was an opening, and I talked him into coming over there, and we worked together there for a while. And then I left there and went back to Salt Lake City, and he stayed. And just kind of an interesting little chapter in his story. He worked at the agencies there for a while, but he wanted to be a comic strip artist. And he worked and worked and worked at that, and it took him years to finally get a strip accepted. But for, more than 25 years now, he's been one of the top comic strip artists in the country. His name's Brian Crane, and he does a strip many of you probably be familiar with called Pickles.
Yes.
Earl and Opal Pickles, an old couple, and all the adventures they go through. But that was my friend and partner, Brian Crane.
Oh, my. Yeah.
So I ended up in Salt Lake City working in an agency, and I was the copywriter and creative director there, and worked in a few agencies around town. And it turned out that I was really pretty good at the advertising business. They like to give people in advertising like to give awards to other people in advertising for creativity and for doing really kind of breakthrough, unusual kind of effective advertising. So there are a lot of organizations that do these awards competitions, and of course the agencies I was with would enter, and my work won hundreds of awards in local and statewide and regional and national and even some international advertising competitions. So my wall was just papered with award certificates from all the work I had done. And I really enjoyed that work. I got to meet a lot of people and learn a lot of things about business, about how businesses work. We'd go tour the factories or the places for the clients we were working for. I learned how they make great big industrial sized bolts. I learned how to cheat slot machines. Learned all kinds of things about health care and got to watch them doing surgery and things like that. And it was just really an interesting kind of work. And that was really all I did for, the better part of 20 years. Never had any inkling of writing anything else other than radio and television commercials and billboards and brochures, magazine and newspaper ads. And that was really satisfying, and I enjoyed it. But when I guess I must have been about 44, 45 years old, I woke up one morning and just wondered if I could do something else. And I wondered if I could write a poem. So I started trying to write poetry. And of course, having been raised in a cowboy family, and while I was in college, I was a bronc rider for the Utah State University Intercollegiate Rodeo team.
Oh my, you really were a writer.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I had one really good year in college rodeo and did pretty well and really enjoyed it. But you get married and you grow up and you realize how bad that hurts, and so most of us kind of drift out of it as we get a little bit older. But I really enjoyed my rodeo days and my days working as a cowboy back when I was growing up at home. And so the poetry I wrote was about that. It was about cowboys in the West. And at that time, cowboy poetry had a big resurgence, and it was really popular. And there were some magazines that published poetry, and I started sending them poems, and they started publishing them. Now, unlike most people involved in cowboy poetry, I really didn't have any desire to be a performer, to stand up on stage and recite poetry. That takes a whole nother kind of talent and a whole bunch of effort that I would rather apply to writing.
It really is a performing art for many of them, isn't it? Yes.
Oh, it is indeed. The people who are good at that, they work hard at it, and they have a talent for it. And as I said, I don't have that talent. It's just not inherent in me. And I knew if I wanted to do that, I'd have to spend a lot of time and effort trying to be even passable at it. And I really chose not to do that. I chose to do, as I said, to devote my time to writing. So I kept writing poems and getting them published. I was a kind of a mainstay in a lot of issues of magazines like Western Horseman and American Cowboy and Range Magazine. My poetry would appear there. And then, this same sense of wonder or curiosity that made me wonder if I could write a poem led me to wonder about short stories. So I started fiddling around writing short fiction and trying to figure out how that worked and to do that and learn to do it well. And along in there somewhere, a friend of mine who was a film director and cinematographer, and he had directed most of the commercials. He and I worked well together, and together we made dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of television commercials and short films for clients. And we really worked together well and did a lot of good work. And he was branching out in filmmaking at the time. He'd been director of photography on some feature films and had made a couple of films of his own and a lot of short films as well as advertising. But he bought the rights to this children's book, and was going to turn it into a feature film. So he gave me the book and says, write a script.
Oh, my.
I didn't know anything about writing movie scripts, but I figured out what the heck, we'll give this a try. So I wrote the script, and he shot the movie, and it's been out, it's 21 years ago now since that movie's been out. And it still shows up on Netflix and places like that from time to time, and it's still out there. But that was my one foray, and one of my few forays into filmmaking. And I enjoyed that, and I loved the production end of it. But making movies, there are a lot of people with their fingers in those pies.
Yes.
So when you're finished, it's hard to look at a movie and think, well, that was mine. I did that. And so I never really pursued that much. Kept working on the short stories, and I joined an organization called Western Writers of America, which is a professional organization. You have to qualify to join through being published, and I barely snuck into it. And there I met a gentleman named Dale Walker, who was editing an anthology of short stories, historically based short stories. And so he invited all the members of Western Writers of America to submit stories for consideration for this anthology, and lo and behold, he chose one of mine among the stories. So that was my first publication of short fiction. And Dale, he looked at a proposal. He was also an acquiring editor for a publisher of Western fiction, and he looked at a proposal I had put together for a book and really liked it, but they weren't going to be buying any new Western fiction at the time. But he was, he's really sorry, because he thought that would have made a really good book. Then a couple of days later, we're at this Western Writers of America convention, and he stopped me in the hallway and asked me if I knew anything about John Muir. And I said, oh, yeah, I know a little, and I told him a story about John Muir, who had been tramping up around in the Sierra Nevada mountains. He was just kind of a hiker and an amateur geologist, did lots of things, very full life. But a windstorm came up, a really big, bad windstorm, really blowing up a gale. And instead of taking shelter, Muir climbed up a tree, got way up in the top of an evergreen tree where the wind was just whipping him back and forth, back and forth. Well, it turns out that I knew more about John Muir than this editor did, and he was really intrigued by that story, and he says, well, I've got a project I'd like to talk to you about. And they were doing this little series of books called American Heroes, which were nonfiction books about different people, different Americans who had done remarkable things. And the fellow they had hired to write a book about John Muir had taken ill and couldn't do it. He was hospitalized. So Dale says, could you do this book? And, what do I know about writing a book? I said, well, sure, I can do that. And I had just a few months to do it in, so I had to do a lot of research and figure out how to write a book, but I pulled it off. It was published, and so that was my first published book, was that book about John Muir.
That is an incredible story. Hey, by the way, you are hearing a wonderful story. This is a story by Rod Miller, and you are in tune with the Creator Entrepreneur Podcast. We're all about new ideas, interesting people, kind of helping you be a little more influential because you use your ideas to make an impact in the world. And Rod is one of those persons, and I've loved, Rod, that what has happened is that you keep growing bigger. And I just did a program on, unfortunately, when we get old, sometimes we just get smaller. And you didn't get smaller, you got bigger. And please, listeners, did you find when in his story he decided to make some changes? Usually when most people just want to settle down and leg it out, Rod, you didn't do that, did you?
No, I haven't done that yet.
That's right. Well, now you got your first book, right?
Morning.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a new day every morning, and you've got to find something to do with it.
That's right.
And I've been lucky to find that.
Okay, now tell us about now you are a book writer. And tell us about what life and writing is all about right now. We've got about 15 more minutes. Well, maybe about that.
Okay, well,
let's go.
If you're ready for a bunch more babbling, here I go.
Here you go. You're on.
Well, about the same time that book came out, I wondered if I could write a novel. I did that. And it was published, and it was really strange to go into an airport and go into the newsstands there and see your book sitting on those shelves. And, that really made you wonder what on earth has happened to me. I didn't know I could do this, but I wanted to give it a try, and by golly, here I am, on the newsstand. So I kept at it, and I started also spread out about that same time into writing for magazines. Some of the magazines I was writing poetry for wanted me to do some articles for them. So they started giving me assignments, and then later I started generating my own ideas and submitting ideas for articles, and they would buy them. And so I started showing up in magazines, wrote lots and lots of magazine articles for several years, really enjoyed that. I'll step back just briefly to my friend Brian Crane that I mentioned does this comic strip Pickles. Well, at some point, for whatever reason, Brian decided that maybe Earl Pickles ought to try to be a cowboy poet. He thought he could have some fun with that in his strip, so he got in touch with me and said, look, here's what I want to do. Can you help me? And so I wrote some short poems for Earl Pickles. I was his ghostwriter. And Brian and I worked together on several strips. So for a few years, he would every now and then, he would drop some in, and they were successful. And then Brian figured out how these poems worked and started writing his own. And so Earl Pickles still to this day will occasionally pop up as a cowboy poet and have some silly little poem in his comic strip.
That's great.
So there I was, still writing for magazines, still writing books, still writing some poetry, and just as I say, every day you get up and you think, what am I going to do today? And you just get an idea and you just dive right into it. Along the way, I wrote a poem. There's a subject I've written a lot about. It's a subject from history that very few people know about. In 1863, on January 29th, on the Bear River, up just over the Idaho border into Utah, or over the Utah border into Idaho, the United States Army attacked a winter camp of Shoshone Indians and killed anywhere from 250 to 350 men, women, and children. And it was the most heinous massacre, the bloodiest massacre of Indians by the United States Army in the history of the West. And hardly anyone has heard of this. It's just kind of disappeared from our history. And so I have sort of tried to do my part to right that wrong, and I've written short stories about it. I wrote a nonfiction book about it that's been out there for several years and is still on the market. And I have a novel coming out this fall about the massacre at Bear River. And somewhere along the way, I wrote a poem about it. In fact, I've written several poems about that subject. But one of them really struck me, and I sent it to a friend of mine who's a cowboy singer, a Western singer and songwriter who tours all over the country, and he's recorded, 15, 16 albums to date. And he was really taken with the poem, and he set it to music. And so, now I'm a songwriter. And
my goodness, you're a songwriter.
Yeah. And Bren recorded this song, put it on one of his albums, and so it's out there. But the best thing about that song is that every year on January 29th, the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation gets together at the site of this massacre for a commemoration ceremony. And it's something that started small and has grown to where hundreds of people attend this thing now. And they've asked Brand for the last couple of years, not this year because of the COVID, they did things differently. It was just a small gathering. But for the 2 years before that, they invited Brand to sing this song at their ceremony. And it's just really touching. I don't, the way Brand put it, it's just really something to sing that song and look into the eyes of the descendants of the people who were killed at that place. And so that, that's really something that you can pay tribute in a sense, I guess, to the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation and the people who have suffered so much in the past, to try to recognize that for them.
That is an incredible story. Could you give us the name? I'm gonna go look that song up.
The title of the song, which is the same as the title of the novel I've got coming out in the fall about the massacre. The title of the song is "And the River Ran Red."
Oh my goodness, what a title!
And the River Ran Red, and it's by Bran Hill, Brennhill, Bran Hill. And he's a pretty popular cowboy singer. Not a country singer. He's a cowboy
singer, yes.
But it's out there. I know it's available wherever you get music, as well as on his album. The album's called Rocky Mountain Drifter. That song is on. So as I said, now I'm a songwriter, and I guess to kind of sum up my whole change in career and how it's developed and changed has been kind of a fluke. It was just all founded on curiosity, waking up one day and wondering, can I do this? And giving it a try and putting in the effort to learn how it's done and to do it right and to do it well. And when you do that, you're always able to learn and do something different. You're always growing, I guess, in a sense.
That's great. That's right. You grow bigger, not just older.
Yeah. And, I don't have to write. I often hear at writers' conferences. I do a lot of presentations at writers' conferences. And a lot of those people say they have to write. It's an obsession. They have to. And I don't really have to. I want to. I want to do it. Some people say writing is difficult. I enjoy it. There's nothing more fun for me than sitting around playing with words. I don't want to play golf. I don't want to go fishing. I don't play video games. I don't really care about going camping or playing fantasy football or any of those other things that a lot of people my age do and people I know. I just want to write. And I love it. I enjoy doing it. And it's resulted, so far I've published 17 books, 3 books of poetry and 4 books of history and a short story collection and 9 novels. And I have 5 more novels that have been accepted by a couple of publishers for publication. And I'm just within a week, maybe 2 weeks of finishing the next one.
Wow. Kind of reminds me of the old line Eric Liddell supposedly said in Chariots of Fire when his sister was upset with him running. He had that great line. He says, "Don't you know God made me fast, and when I run, I feel His pleasure." I almost kind of feel that must happen to you. When you write, you feel the pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. I can't imagine anything more fun. When I was learning about advertising back all those many years ago, I read a book that was really influential in me wanting to do that and learn it. And it was written by an old advertising guy who was kind of a wild-eyed fellow back then, very famous, very well known, worked at several agencies and had one of his own. His name was Jerry Della Femina.
Yes.
And this book was called From Those Wonderful Folks Who Gave You Pearl Harbor, which was a play on doing advertising for a Japanese company. It was just kind of a trick thing or a joke.
I remember that.
But he had said something in that book that kind of stayed with me all those years, and it applies not only to advertising but to everything else I've done. He said advertising is the most fun you can have with your clothes on.
That's right. Yes, he was the character, right? Well, we're gonna do this again with your permission, as we say, but we're gonna have to close it down for today. This has been fascinating, so I'm gonna ask you to do 3 things, okay? First of all, I'd like you to promise to come back, and then second, I'd like you to tell the people how they could get your good stuff, and then I'll give you my third, okay? Go.
Okay. Well, number one, I'd be happy to come back if you'll have me. You know, I kind of feel like I just opened my mouth and the words dribble down the front of my shirt. But if somebody can make any sense out of them, I'm happy to come back again. They can find me online. I'm easy to find on there. I have a website. It's writer Rod Miller.com. So writer as in writing, and my name, Rod Miller, all one word, .com. And on there, you know, there are information about all my books and links to where you can get them if you want them, and links to a blog that I also do. And there's also another website that you can find on there. It's called rawhiderobinson.com. And Rawhide Robinson is a character in 3 of my existing books and 1 forthcoming book, who's just a cowboy who tells tall tales. But my primary website's writerrodmiller.com, and you can find me there.
There you go, and we'll be back, and you will be coming back. I'm grateful for that opportunity. And number 3, please, as you told me the story about what you have done for that situation, that story at the Shoshone Indians, I just want you to receive my personal blessings for being part of the reason that thing happened. Okay? Please do so.
Well, thank you.
Hey, all the best and blessings to all of you. You have been listening to interesting people tell interesting stories, and they're here to encourage you. Whatever age or stage you are at, there is something more that you can grow up, grow into, and maybe even achieve some true greatness. So, we'll be back. Take care, ride tall, and stay safe and be smart. Bye for now.